Hello and welcome. This is Shifa Bloom on the What is God podcast. On this podcast, I ask people from all walks of life to answer their answer to the question, what and where is God and what does it have to do with me? And today I'm here with my friend Fee. She is an artist, a creative, a designer, and a spiritual mentor doing really beautiful things. And Fee and I recently got to have a conversation about what is God on her platform. And it was really a lot of fun. And this is a topic that she's deeply immersed in her work and the way that she mentors and guides people into, their creativity and their alignment. And so, Fee, welcome.
Hi, Shiva. It's so good to be here. Thanks for the beautiful introduction.
It's really sweet to be here with you too. And I like to just jump right in and go go deep from the get-go. And so feel free to share, you know, anything of your journey that you want to share as well, like on how you've come to be this person who's so deeply immersed in spirituality and helping others with their develop their relationship to God. And I'd love to hear from you your answer to the question, what and where is God, and what does it have to do with me?
Yeah. Yeah. So it feels helpful to talk a little bit about my background. Um, I was raised Catholic, very, very much immersed in the religion. Went to Catholic school from the age of 4 up until the age of 18. And growing up, I was just really naturally oriented towards spirituality. So some of my earliest memories are basically just like being in prolonged prayer and convening with God through art and poetry. And I was quite hermetic as a kid, which continues to shape my path. And like most people that are embedded in a religion from a young age, I left it at a young age as well. Um, I left the church. I mean, leaving the church when it's a part of your culture is interesting, right? Because I was going to church with my family
Mm-hmm.
while I was no longer oriented towards the religion.
Mm-hmm.
But once I went off on my own when I was 17, I pretty much dismissed Christianity. And despite having left the church, my relationship with God has just continued to blossom and deepen. Um, yeah, and I find my connection with God through art, through time in nature, through relationship, through prolonged prayer. Um, and interestingly enough, on my journey, I've more recently been led back into Christianity, more from a mystical lens. So I experienced God through what's probably traditionally seen as like a mystic's experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it was through the mystical journey and actually working with a teacher that's in the tantric lineage, the traditional yogic tantric lineage, that I've come more and more in resonance with Christianity from a mystical lens. And um, now my work is around guiding people. I do a pretty broad range of mentorship and coaching. I actually really resonate with the term like fulfillment coaching. A lot of what I'm doing is about helping people orient towards what's fulfilling for them. And it's my belief that through orienting towards what's fulfilling to you is like that's your channel to God often.
Mm-hmm.
So some of what I'm doing is like more career oriented coaching, more creative oriented coaching. Sometimes it's like purely spiritual coaching, but really like helping people orient towards an experience of God, which is what I care about the most.
That's cool. And as you were speaking, I was remembering that um, one of the things that's so cool about what you teach and share in the world is these different like archetypes, right? Or I don't know how you would word it, but these different ways that we can connect to God through like, don't you teach it through these different archetypes and faces?
Yeah, that's an aspect of my work. So right now I'm in the middle of launching a program called Oh My God, which is about orienting towards God through the Christian archetypes and stories. So we think about Christianity and God has all of these faces, right? We've got like the Holy Spirit, we've got the Savior, Jesus, we've got the Creator, you've
Yeah.
got the Mother. And so I'm so interested in helping people have the experience of God, but metaphor is so helpful. Like this is why
Mm.
studying with lineage can be one of the many reasons why studying with lineage can be so supportive to the spiritual path is that the lineage has these stories that have been passed down,
Yeah.
and these stories help us orient towards God from like a relational standpoint. And so
Yeah.
I'm looking at these archetypes of how God appears in the Bible and in the Christian narrative, and sort of like washing away the distortion so that people can actually come to these archetypes as a place to relate to God from and
Mm.
have our experience.
It's really interesting to me because I'm not from a Christian lineage, right? So some of these things that are probably very common in American Christian culture, it's it's interesting to me. I come with a lot of curiosity, like truly to want to learn more of this perspective of what is God. So yeah, I'd love any elaborating that you want to dive deeper. There's a lot of ways that we could go with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to elaborate. I also want to touch on the questions that frame the podcast as a whole, like what is God?
Yeah.
What does it have to do with me?
Yeah.
Because like these are archetypes and these are stories and these are ways to enter relationship with God.
Yeah.
But in essence, God is everything. Like there's,
Mm.
as my teacher says, there's only one thing happening. And that should feel really confronting, that there's really only one thing happening amidst the suffering and the beauty and the joy and the confusion and the chaos. It's just one thing, and it's God experiencing God through us. And this is very much like a non-dual lens of like there's only one thing happening. Literally it's non-dual.
Yeah.
um and
So that's important to preface with. Yeah.
yeah, and what I'm talking about, like when I talk about relationship, like inevitably there's two in
Mm.
relationship. And so and I believe that there is only one thing happening, and yet the most important way to connect to the one thing happening is through relationship. And so a lot of like what I'm teaching and orienting people towards is that through the dual lens we reach non-duality. Through relationship we merge into oneness. It's not like we're trying to just totally strip ourselves away into oneness. It's actually through relating. And because when we relate, we allow ourselves to enter healing relationship. And when we heal, we come into wholeness. And when we come into wholeness, we come into unity. And so it's
Mm.
an important part of the process to try to build intimacy with God, even though there's only one thing happening.
That's very cool. Yeah, in the Jewish tradition, we have a prayer that's probably the most common that you say the most often. And it essentially means um, God is our God and God is one. That's what it means.
I love it.
And and yeah, and then that as that I think a lot of truths that I hold to be true are also paradox. And the example that I usually give when I give an example of this is, well, for example, I'm me and you're you and you're Fee and I'm Shifra. We're not the same. And we're part of one big great oneness and we're the same, you know? So I like that you touched on that, that there's one, there's oneness, one thing happening, and we experience that one thing happening through the opposite truth, which is simultaneously just as true, which is that we are many things happening.
Totally. And one way I like to teach this in like a more like embodied metaphor is that you can see something with two eyes, and then you can see like you can wink or like, switch your eyes, and you're kind of like seeing the same view but like slightly altered. So it's like we've got like unity, like looking through both eyes, but then you're looking through one eye and you're like, your
I'm
viewpoint
like,
kind of shifts, right? There's a lot of stuff that I like to think about with like the eyes, like softening your gaze and like the things, like everything sort of merges. But yeah, like it's like we're just looking at the same thing from different eyes, or even from different viewpoints, like thinking about zooming in or zooming out. um it's like the same exact reality and the same exact truth, but just like two ways of being with the truth. um I don't know if that made sense, but
it makes sense to me.
about as much sense as any of this can make.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to articulate and define in words that which ultimately is beyond words. So,
Okay, totally.
hmm.
Yeah. And then what does it have to do with us? I mean, to me, it's kind of like, what doesn't it have to do? I I think that the secret to a really good life is faith, and like having faith in the single consciousness moving through everything, because
Hmm.
we can only receive so much logic to understand what's happening. Like so many people think that like a good life is accomplished by understanding things, and then from their understanding like choosing the best behaviors or the best most aligned path,
Hmm.
when in reality like your logic is capable of so little in comparison to the master logic that is uh, animating everything. And so to me, what it has to do with me is like, oh wow, this is like the fact that there's one thing happening, and I'm maybe, if I'm lucky, 10% of the time feeling and knowing and experiencing that through my body, and half the other time I'm just being a human that's scared and happy and all the mess
Yeah.
of things. Like what it has to do with me is like, oh, this is where faith comes in. This is like, without faith, I'm just living from the truth of my experience. And I am constantly working to have more of an experience that feels like I'm with God and in union with God, but without the constant awareness that there is one thing happening, and
Hmm.
without holding my faith as like the pillar, you just sort of like, I feel that I just like fragment. I just like, I don't have a tether to that oneness.
Hmm. I want to go deeper into the idea of faith, if we can.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of questions about faith. For example, how can people tap more into faith? But also, what does that even really mean? And I know sometimes people, I've been podcasting a lot, so I feel it in my voice. I know sometimes people will question because this idea of faith, well, then if we have faith, how much of our lives are we passive versus how much of our lives are we, active participants versus passive participants? There's a lot around faith, questions like that. And then on the other side, I'm also curious if there's any stories of, well, what does faith really feel like or look like? Or what is a time when you felt the experience of faith and it impacted your life? So you can really go either way with that.
Yeah. So I was having a breakthrough conversation with a client yesterday, and the topic of faith came up.
Hmm.
And this is someone who feels really lost in the moment about their work, and like um when you're like dissatisfied with your work but you don't even know what would satisfy you, or when you're dissatisfied with anything, you don't know what would satisfy you.
Right.
um and then for many people it's really easy to enter like a season of being really like distractible,
Hmm.
like consuming a lot to kind of fill in the void as opposed to
Hmm.
being with the void. And a question that I brought to her was, do you assume that this has a happy ending?
Hmm.
And like she was like, think it's maybe possible.
Mm.
And I was like, no, faith is the assumption. Faith is like, I'm assuming that this whole thing ends great,
Mm.
whether it like the struggles I'm experiencing within my career, relationally, um, the broader, oh my God, the broader storyline of what's happening within the world.
Mhm.
I assume there's a happy ending. And you can get even more like meta and existential and be like, there is no ending. But from my like dualistic human experience, I assume it's a happy ending. And what that does is it provides me with so much faith that this wherever I am in my timeline of experience, there it is orienting me towards my highest good. And like there is no losing. Like I I even truly think that if I mean, I don't believe in heaven and hell, but I believe that when I die, I merge back into unity consciousness. I merge back into God. And so honestly, sometimes I'm like, what's the worst that can happen? I die and I go back to God. Like really, that's the worst that can happen.
Mm.
And death is a very nuanced and tricky and big subject, but faith enables me to take bigger risks towards the life that I think serves me and humanity the best.
Mhm.
And faith allows me to rest in the mystery as opposed to wrestle with the mystery. And that's where I think people really feel the absence of faith the most, is when their logic has nothing to grasp onto, or their emotional experience is so
Mm.
dense that it feels like absolutely mysterious and dark. Faith allows you to float within that mystery. Whereas without faith, you're doing the desperate doggy paddle thing. And when
Mm.
you do the desperate doggy paddle thing, you like overwork your system. You don't notice where there's like a shore nearby. You don't like stop to look at the sky. And faith like really allows you to just like surrender, really. Like that's what we're talking about. It's
Right.
surrendering into the unknown.
It makes me think back on times in my life in the past where I was really struggling, and going back in time in my mind's eye and seeing that version of myself and just giving her love, and then also learning the lesson of like, oh, if I could have had faith then, it wouldn't have changed necessarily, or maybe it would have, but the external circumstance. But the thought is that I didn't, all of the anxiety and emotional pain, perhaps on some level it was necessary because it was part of my human experience and part of what now makes me be able to help others, right? And there's this knowing that, oh, that situation was going to change no matter what. This too shall pass. It will be different, And had I been able to tap deeper into faith, what if next time when life gives me unknowns, or circumstances come up, like what if I could just somehow know that this too shall pass, and allow myself to just be present, and maybe spinning and having all that anxiety isn't necessary, because in hindsight, the anxiety didn't help me get anywhere. Like that wasn't the tool that helped me to move forward. And so that's what this conversation about faith makes me think about, is also that past version of myself and this really gentle maternal feeling like, oh, honey, it's going to be okay. And so now when I have that feeling, those, darker or harder feelings come up too, it's almost like I can reach in from this future place and tell me now, honey, it was okay last time. It really sucked and it hurt for a minute and then it was okay. It's most likely still going to be really okay. And whatever happens, it's okay.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like everything, but especially everything in relationship to God and spirituality, there is so much nuance, because I have also spiritually bypassed my own experience by having blind faith. Like
Mm,
there's something about, I mean, faith requires you to not know, but there's a way that you can spiritually bypass your experience by like patching faith on it and being like, it's gonna be okay, it's gonna be okay. Like, and
right.
I noticed that especially is prevalent when people are praying for miracles but not doing anything. Because
Yeah, that question of passive active.
in order for anything to change, you have to like completely orient towards it.
Hmm.
It's like I forget that phrase, but that like you're sort of like where your intention is or where your energy is pointed is the thing that grows.
Right.
And so faith,
Energy flows where attention goes.
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like faith is a part of that equation. Your attention is still required. Your like full orientation towards the discomfort is still required. And I see for people that are, especially a lot of people that have been like raised in a religion that haven't really deviated, the deviation is almost required
Mm,
at times because that's where like when you question something and like when you wrestle with it is where you get to like fill in the holes and strengthen it. And
mm,
I see a lot of people that have been raised in a faith that like didn't, or a religion that didn't really deviate at any point or ask the harder questions. Um, they have a lot of blind faith, which is like
mm.
they're just patching everything with like God's gonna take care of it, God's gonna take care of it, God's gonna take care of it, and it's like
Right.
okay, but you're also God, so
And we live in the world of action, right?
yeah, like God created the laws of nature, and we still have to play the game in relationship to the laws of nature of like
Mm.
cause and effect and polarity and duality, and it's like we still have to play that game.
Have you ever heard that story? It reminds me of that there's a flood and there's a guy and he's praying for someone to come save him, and his neighbor comes with a car and says, "Hurry, get out." Do you know the story? His neighbor says,
Keep
"Hurry, get
going.
out. Come on, there's a flood coming. Let's drive you away." And he says, "No, no, no, God's gonna save me." And his neighbor goes away, and then the flood comes, and now it's like really the streets are getting flooded, and someone comes by with a canoe or something and is like, "Come on, we're gonna get out. Like, we've got a spot for you." And he says, "No, no, no, God's gonna save me." And so the boat goes away. And then now he's like on his roof, and there's, a bigger motorboat that comes, and he says, "No, God's gonna save me." And then he's, on the very top of his roof, and a helicopter comes, and he says, "No, no, no, God's gonna save me." And then when he dies, he goes to God and he says, "God, why didn't you save me?" And God says, "I sent you a car, I sent you a canoe, I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter. What else did you want me to do?"
Yeah, yeah.
It's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah. And we have to be willing to see that miracles are not often in the shape that we think that they're going to come in.
So, what are miracles? Can we talk about miracles?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about miracles. What is a miracle? That's a word that I haven't actually ever tried to define.
Yeah, have I defined it before? I guess it's like we hear of these miracles from a biblical perspective, right? And then we say, well, and we live in the world of action where we get to live by the laws of nature, which were created by God, which is a miracle in and of itself. So where, I love exploring something that I like to work with, and I'm pretty sure you do too, is this place where some of our natural ability that is actually within the wider laws of nature, where we tap into that. And the difference between what is this world that we live in really capable of, and how much of my belief of what's possible is limited by laws that are actually in my mind and not actually what the laws of nature actually are. Um, and I think the experiment is called have you heard of Schrodinger's cat? I think that's the name of it.
Not too
Is
sure.
I think, and I'll have to look it up for the show notes or whatever, so I don't miss it. But it's this experiment I'm going to paraphrase the experiment because as I remember it, but basically there's these cats, and some of the cats grow up in a room with only horizontal lines on the wall. And then some of the cats grow up in a room with only vertical lines on the wall. And then after they grow up, they're put in a different setting that has bars that are vertical or horizontal. And the cats could not see the bars that were the one that wasn't the room that they grew up in, if that makes sense. I'm gonna
Mm,
have to verify that, and if it's wrong, I'll add a correction or a link or something. But basically, that there are limitations that are actually true. So for example, if the cat can't see a bar with a horizontal line, it still can't walk past it. But it
mm,
doesn't know why it can't walk past it. And it thinks that there's just maybe a law of nature that says you can't go past this point, when really it just needs to turn sideways.
mm. That's so
And
interesting.
so to get past the point of the horizontal bar for a cat that grew up in a vertical lined world, it would seem like a miracle that they got to the other side of the room, past this invisible force field, but they just couldn't see it. And the other cat somehow opened up its senses to where it figured out all I have to do is turn sideways to go through the bars. It was it a miracle, you know?
Yeah, I love this idea of like miracles occur when we open up our senses. I think where I'm starting to land in terms of like a pseudo definition is that miracles are divine intervention that happens beyond logic. And in that way, I feel that I'm experiencing miracles all the time. And
Mm.
so like there's like a caterpillar that's attached to the side of my office. It's been in its process of metamorphosis, and I look at it every day and I feel the miracle of this thing that I've just like cannot fucking comprehend. Part of me, I cursed,
It's okay. It's so amazing.
but it's really just like where my comprehension ends, and I feel God. That's where like the miracle is, and it requires you to get really humble because actually we don't know that much, and most of the time we think we know things that we don't actually know. And when you humble yourself or you let life humble you, you actually expand your senses and your ability to perceive more of the miracle that's already happening.
I appreciate your comment about the need to be really humble in this situation, because I think, especially in this Western culture, uh, we do think we know a lot, and we think, oh, it's 2023, but they said that when it was 1823. Well, it's 1823, well, it's 2023 and we have so much science and we know so much. But the truth is that then studies will come out a decade later that will prove wrong, what may have been proven before. And we discover new information. And even in, I think of this regarding healing from illness in the healing world. Even when we take a Western medicine approach, an allopathic approach, like, we're still trying to research why certain diseases are happening. And there's lots of theories, and you can find theories that very logically and rationally back up opposite possibilities, And so I think there's a lot of need to be humble and go, we don't really always know the mechanisms behind why certain things happen, like why some person got a particular illness, or why some person was able to heal from that exact same illness and another person wasn't. It really, when we think about that category of things, of healing and illness, to me, that's beyond logic. Even though our medical is so advanced now, there's also so much that is really, there's something deeper going on that I think taps into the emotional spiritual plane, which then gets reflected in our physical world in different ways. And then some of it's karmic and it's even beyond that, or some of it's ancestral and even beyond that.
Yeah, totally, totally. And like that the unknown of like, is this karmic, is this ancestral, like, is this luck, like even the unknown itself, which is like beyond logic, to me is a miracle. Like that we get to like blossom and unfurl in this unknown that is beyond my logic, that is like inevitably designed by God and maintained by God. Like that is a miracle itself. Like we're in like miracle on miracle on miracle land, you know?
It's
And
a
just
miracle when we wake up.
absolutely, absolutely. And like even the fact that we can think we know things and then be proven wrong, and like we're still here living on planet Earth with the same laws of nature, with the same way of like birthing life and leaving life. It's like that that unchanging part and the resiliency of humanity is a miracle. I'm constantly in awe of our resiliency. Like that to me is perhaps the biggest miracle.
Yeah, the resiliency and just even to be a human being. I love asking you these definitions. I think you're a very deep thinker and you're very poetic. So I'm like wanting to ask you, we've talked about what are miracles, we've talked about what is God, but Fee, what is a human being?
Oh God.
Oh God.
maybe that's
I
maybe
didn't
that's
even throw that on you. I did not prepare her for these questions, you guys.
I mean, there's certainly like some scientific answer to this question of like what is a human being, but
But from the mystic's perspective,
yeah. Well, I really believe that all of this life is God experiencing herself, himself, their self. Um, and that humanity is the path in which God remembers herself best through this life.
hmm.
Um, you know what? In describing, I can't believe I want to go here, but it's been really top of mind. So I'm, like I said, I've been sort of like yanked into the Christian lineage again. And the one aspect of Christianity that like I've not fully until recently come into like a heartfelt understanding of has been Jesus.
Hmm.
Because I'm someone that actually like doesn't really pray to saints or to any like intermediaries. I'm just like, why don't you just go straight to the source? Like it doesn't really
Hmm.
make sense why you wouldn't, you know? I mean, I understand now why people pray to the saints. They like embody a certain grace of the human experience that has touched union with God that's um closer to the ground. But the Jesus story is something that I really just like could not get behind. I was like, yeah, cool dude, whatever. And I've been just like recently brought into this place where I can like finally really appreciate the story. And I promise this is relevant because Jesus is like God made
Very
human, right?
relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so from my perspective, and speaking kind of from like a Christian mystic lens for a moment, we've got God, which is like the only thing happening, source, the all, and God descends in into into nature. So God becomes nature, and nature is humanity, right? So God comes into incarnation as nature and as humanity, and then God comes down as Jesus. And my understanding of this is that Jesus comes to pave the way for humanity to understand how to merge with God, like to have like a real experience where like humans can be like, oh, that's what it looks like. It doesn't just look like going to the top. I mean, it can, but it doesn't just look like going to like the top of a mountain by myself and like managing a garden and being like, fuck humanity, you know? Like Jesus was embedded in community, and he wasn't a pushover by any means. He picked fights, and he stood for what he cared for. And so my understanding of the Jesus story was like, okay, God potentially was seeing humanity, and was seeing humanity in all of its imperfections, meaning just like it's fall from grace, it's separation, and was like, okay, humanity needs like some examples. And I think that Jesus and Buddha and like I think every religion, they have some embodiment, some incarnation of this. I don't think Jesus is the only one. But we're going to talk about Jesus, and that Jesus dies for our sins, which is just like Jesus dies for the experience of separation. So sin is just separation from God. It's like when we behave in a sinful way, we're bringing ourselves farther from unity. And that's just what sin is. It's just like, is this decision bringing you closer or farther from God? And sin is just choosing the path of separation. And what Jesus does, and this is something that's like recorded by many, many, many Christian mystics, it just slips through the cracks in church, in my experience, is that when Jesus dies for our sins, it's not like he's paying a debt back. There's actually a moment where Jesus becomes sin. So Jesus fully becomes separation. For a moment on the cross, Jesus forgets that he is God.
Mm.
And then he transcends it. Then he dies. There's like the 3-day grace period of like the sort of like the process of transformation, that like unknown of like, when do we rise? But then Jesus rises into the right hand of his Father, into unity with God. And how that happens, or why that happens, is because God wants sin to be also a path to unity. Like, and so my belief is that humanity is God's most precious creation for remembering herself through her own creation. Because now there's no such thing as being separate from God, because even when you sin, even when you're in separation, that is a path for transformation. That is a path for coming back into unity. So there's actually no wrong turn. Like, and there's eternal forgiveness. Because if you're sinning, and even within that sin is the seed for coming back into unity with God, you're never alone. You're never unforgiven. You're never so far away that you can't come into unity. Like, it is literally available for every human being. And to me, that's why God creates humanity, is like to experience herself as remembering herself over and over again. And even when she forgets, she can remember.
Remembering. Wow. I'm really glad you took it in that direction, because especially that I'm speaking to someone who is tapped into Christian mysticism. I really appreciate getting to hear the Jesus narrative being told and explained from a mystical lens, and just hearing it in general, because a lot of the listeners are Christian and a lot of the listeners are not Christian. And so it's nice to, it's like, why wouldn't we go there? Like what?
And like at the heart of Christianity, and I actually, I have not yet gotten to a place where I like fully claim Christianity as like, this is mine. I still, like, I learned from a tantric teacher, and I really feel all of them, but I feel that God is moving me in this direction of like, this is my path. But at the heart of Christianity, I see these two things. One, the relationship with God is the process, is the point. It's like how we build intimacy with God through archetypes, through our own experience, through recognizing the miracles of life. It's all opportunity for building intimacy. And like that is the path to unity. That is the path to remembering God, and remembering yourself as God is through that intimacy. And then the second aspect of Christianity that, like, honestly, even the churches that don't totally get it right, I see that they say this and they don't really like back it up with good evidence, but that God is love. And to me, like, to come down as a God being, already a God being, Jesus, Buddha, whoever, specifically the Jesus story, to come down as a human and then merge with suffering, merge with sin, so that can become a path directly back to God. Like, that's the most loving thing that a God could do. It's like, hey, I see that you're in separation. Like, I see that y'all are not like figuring out this heaven on earth thing. So like, what I'm going to do is make it that like, even when you fuck up, there is a direct line back to me. And like so that you can't ever really fuck up. Or like, you can't ever be so fucked up that there's like no orienting back towards God.
I think that gives hope, that narrative, right? That even if someone feels lost or separate, that ultimately there's still an access point to come home.
Yeah, and I think it, like, kind of tying a bow on the faith conversation, I think it helps with faith. And
Mm.
I don't see it as like a get out of jail for free pass, like that you can do no wrong, because we do have a duty to this planet and to each other. But that there's my faith can rest in the fact that, like, I'm I'm never out of alignment, because even when I'm in separation, there's still a path directly to God. And when I'm in separation, it's because my choices and all of life guided me to that. Like, if it
Mm.
was supposed to happen any other way, it would have.
Mm.
So, like, my faith rests in the fact that, like, there's always a direct line to God, even when I think I'm doing it wrong. God loves me so much that, like, everything is like happening with that intention, even when it looks like separation and suffering. And my assumption, therefore, is that, like, it always has a happy ending. And it
I
may
love
not always feel good to my system, but it's always going to have a happy ending. So, like,
that.
yeah, I have some pretty strong faith that, like, we're going to be okay.
Well, I bless us all that we may all have faith in the happy ending and that we may all experience the happy ending. And I took some notes while you were talking, and so I'll just kind of recap some of the main points. We went really deep. We gave definitions to a lot of hard to define concepts and words, from, faith to miracles to you even threw in a definition of sin in there, which
Yeah, my
I just
favorite
added it to the dictionary, to the list, and God and human, and just really thank you for sharing your insight and wisdom and experience on this really vast topic.
word.
I would love to also let folks know, if they enjoyed this conversation and want to hear more of your perspective, or how your teachings and perspective might be able to add depth to their personal experience. How can they find more about you? How can they connect with you?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing an invitation space. So I'm very active on Instagram. You can find me at fionanodar.com, or no, Fiona Nadar on Instagram, or fionanodar.com. That's my
Okay.
website. And in terms of working together, I may or may not have a series that's open when you hear this. A series called Oh My God, which is an 8-week series about building intimacy with God through these Christian stories and archetypes. But I also love, love, love working one-on-one with people. And so if you're someone that's interested in a more personalized experience of connecting to God, experiencing how grace is moving through your life, finding your own fulfillment, energizing yourself creatively, these are all topics that we work through one-on-one together. So you can reach out to me, or find a way to reach out to me on my website.
Amazing. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, or if you are tired of people using God to shame and disconnect people and want to contribute to connection, then please go ahead and like or subscribe to this podcast. And you can hear more of the episodes that are coming soon. If you're interested in reaching out or working with me personally, I offer personal coaching. I also offer readings from my card deck that I created, and you can find all of that and more at shifrabloom.com, as well as the release of my book, The Four Worlds: Discovering Your Inner Magic Through Kabbalah, which is launching this summer, which I'm excited about. So with all of that said, thank you so much, Fee, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will see you next time.